I've got a question for you all. When you think about your day-to-day life, how it goes, what kind of actions you take, what sort of things you do on a daily basis, what sort of video game do you see your life as? You might answer this question with one game in particular, or you can go about answering it by way of a genre. However you decide to answer, this question has time and again been one of my favorite to ask amongst friends, if only to see what kind of answers they come up with. Speculating on events in their life and how they break everything down in their lives, that question is always super interesting to me in a for fun sort of way. And over the course of this video, I want to go about breaking down the mechanical eccentricities of this real-life video game that we're making. The reason I'm even making a video like this is just for the fun of it. A lot of you know that I'm sort of a fan of speculative game design already, and the reason this video is even here is just to answer the question of why not. Now, there's probably a fair few of you who don't really see the point of this video and maybe think it's stupid. And if that is the case, well, you are right. And I mean, if you don't want to humor this video in its entirety, then you have the ability to dislike the video and just leave if you want to. But for the rest of you who say, why not? Well, again, I want to pop the question, and I think it's a fun thing to do if you want to do it in your own friend circle. What kind of game do you and your friends think your life is? What kind of mechanics does this game have? And for me, it's the sort of question that leads to more questions when you come up with answers for it. I think it's a fun topic to discuss whenever I'm just bored and hanging out with friends, don't really have anything better to do. It's the sort of thing that gives you something to think about. And depending on how deeply you involve yourself with the topic, you can come up with some pretty fun answers. The structure of this video is going to frame each individual moment in a person's life and portray it as a video game mechanic. It's going to be pretty all-encompassing, and it's mostly just going to be stuff that everybody has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Just, again, gamified. Each answer that I come up with here is going to be pretty vague, so if you have your own words to say, then go ahead and leave it in the comments. Like I said, I love talking about this sort of thing. And I mean, hey, if you have some food for thought, go ahead and lay it out there. And without any further ado, let's start by breaking down the stats that's present in most every video game. Health, stamina, and magic. Okay, so we're gonna kind of start off in a weird order at first here. I want to start off with stuff that's easy to explain at first and then gradually gets harder to come up with an answer for. So starting off here, let's bring in stamina. Or, sorry, I guess stamina because I can't spell. Now, admittedly, stamina doesn't show up in every game, but the games it does show up in often has it as sort of a resource that needs to be carefully managed. Stamina typically dictates certain player actions, and it regenerates quickly whenever it's used. But also, what might be wise to consider is that we don't need to include stamina if we don't want to. Many games don't anyway, so if we just don't want to add it, we don't have to. We can use this particular meter to sort of gauge every individual action you do. Walking around, running, exerting yourself in any way, that's going to cost stamina. I think it's pretty easy to figure out what this is supposed to do, but my own unique little wrinkle I do want to add to this is make it to where the more you use stamina, the lower your max stamina gets until you adequately rest for long enough. Say for instance if you're working on a project or doing some sort of laborious task at work or something. That's going to consume stamina, and the more that you use it, the lower it's going to get. You need to be able to take a break, and sometimes those breaks can be as long as a day or a couple days. And yeah, like I said, all of this is super obvious, and it's pretty easy to give this a proper description and label. We will wrap back around to stamina at some point, and that'll be whenever we start talking about HP. But for now, I do think this does work. But now let's move on to something a lot less tangible, a little bit more subjective. What could we classify magic as? The magic bar, the mana bar, the focus meter, energy, spirit, soul. Your magic dictating bar stat kind of has a lot of names that it goes by, depending on the game that you look at. And obviously, when trying to relate all of this to a real life scenario, there's no such thing as magic. At least not the sort of fireball casting, stuff like that. As cool as that would be, magic isn't a thing in the real world. So obviously, that means we need to appropriate it in some way. But how do we do that? Well, let's think about it like this. Typically, whenever you are consuming magic in a video game, you are activating some sort of special ability. And typically, magic has something to do with the mind of a character. So what if we made it to where magic in this scenario was your creativity with solving a problem? We can generalize the inability to come up with a solution to be you being out of mana or something. Or maybe, if the problem is just so out of your wheelhouse, you didn't have enough quote-unquote magic to handle the situation in the first place. This could mean that people in the real world are incredibly creatively endowed. I also think this works because, like your body, your mind too needs to rest. And depending on how you rest, your magic might come back at a faster rate than somebody else. And also, your abilities, the things that consume this mana bar, would be particular ideas. If you have to sort of MacGyver something together and make this weird Ruth Goldberg machine of random things thrown together, or just duct taping something together, that required a particularly powerful thought in order for you to figure out. Your efficacy of which could be dependent on how knowledgeable you are in that subject, and this will tie into an intelligence stat later on, but I think it does fit with the wider theme of mana in a real-world scenario. Now, with all that being said, I'm pretty sure we have magic pretty nailed down at this point. Now let's go ahead and finish off this segment with the big, scary, elephant-sized cryptid in the room, HP. But first, let me ask you another question. What does the acronym of HP stand for? Go ahead and just say it out loud, or say it in your head for a second. Okay, cool. Now, do me a favor and ask your friend what they think HP stands for. One or both of y'all probably said something along the lines of hit points or health points, or if you're a fan of the Mario RPG series, heart points. Some of you might have even said stamina, despite HP not fitting with that word. And the truth is that you really couldn't have gotten this question wrong. See, because a lot of games also call health a different thing. The reason health in this context is such a hard thing to nail down is because games themselves are sort of inconsistent with what they even call it. What really happens when your HP drops to 0 in a game? You might just fall unconscious or faint or something. It could result in a game over, but sometimes it just doesn't. And what's more, how do we quantify being hurt and lowering some sort of invisible bar? When do we get to the point where we can no longer take damage? Well, for that, I have a couple of ideas as well. Let's just establish something right off the bat. If you get hurt in the real world, I do think your health should go down. That makes sense. If you stub your toe or something, you're going to lose a little bit of HP. If you get into some sort of horrible, debilitating accident, that's gonna make you lose a lot more health, obviously. But here's another thing to maybe consider. If something doesn't quite go your way in the real world, maybe that also lowers your health. You could use health as sort of a way to measure how much you, excuse my French, give a f*** today. This to me is what I think stamina means in the context of a health bar, whether it be in a game or in the real world. But establishing health like this, as both a measure of how much physical damage you take and how much emotional damage you take, well, I don't know, I think that just works for me. Of course, you could interpret this as being a lot more conventional, with the whole physical taking damage bit, and that works too. But I sort of feel like if we don't address the day-to-day turmoils that people deal with, then we're gonna have to come up with a new bar stat for that too. And we can call it like morale or something. But there is a big part of me that wants to keep this whole thing simple, and it's not just because I want to keep looking for assets and making custom art. If we're not careful, we might over-bloat this proverbial game with too many mechanics, and that just wouldn't be fun anymore. Oh man, I didn't even notice. Looks like I'm missing just a little bit of health. Let me top up real quick. But actually, now that I think about it, what would happen here? Let's take this opportunity real quick to just talk about how items would work. I'd wager to guess that equipment is pretty simple. Most clothing wouldn't give you many stats at all, maybe just like a couple points of defense. But I suppose things like a helmet or something would obviously bump up that number quite a bit. At the behest of some other stats for sure. I think most clothing would literally have something equating to style points, like quite deliberately some sort of actual number that dictates how stylish something is. And I mean, temperature would be important too, actually. Maybe if you put on something like running shoes that would actually improve your agility stat. Depending on how some shoes are designed, this does fit, I think. Boots would give you kind of a lot of defense, but obviously would hamper a lot of your agility. This specifically is really funny to think about just because there's kind of a lot you can do with this. What kind of garments would govern what kinds of stats and stuff? And I don't know, that's fun, but what about like consumable items? Health items can obviously get pretty weird, just because, like before when we were discussing HP, certain things that lower it might influence what heals it back. Would food in the real world really constitute your health coming back? And it might, if we're going with the emotional angle that HP might have. Might feel better after eating something and stuff like that. But also it can influence stamina too. Maybe it influences max stamina, a la the Monster Hunter games. A fun little thing I've always thought about from a real game thing that I wanted to implement was actually incorporating both medicine and food as a healing item. My personal answer to this would be that food heals a hard number of health back. A burger or something would restore like a flat 20 HP, but medicine would heal a percentile. And maybe you would heal it like slower or something, I think that works. At the end of the day, health can lower and we need a way to restore it. We don't really have like a health potion in real life or anything. So I think appropriating it in this way does work for me. But speaking of stats, what would our stat sheet look like? Well, if you ask me, there's a couple of answers for this too. So, let's go ahead and open up our stats screen real quick. Well, that's interesting. This menu looks a little empty right now. And that's because we need to find the stats that would properly populate this menu. And for that, I would like to use the format that so many other games use, where they use one word that is vague enough to determine the entirety of a stat. We can get a couple of examples right off the bat, right? Strength is pretty obvious. You need to be strong to be able to handle some things. Carry certain amounts of pounds, stuff like that. I threw around agility, so we can put that in here too. Let's just say that agility is your efficiency with moving around, how fast and how agile you are. These are good, but what else? I suppose we can complete the status bar trifecta by putting intelligence down on here. Intelligence gets kinda weird though when you start thinking about it. How do you quantify intelligence? What makes you smarter? Is it just knowing more things? Or is it how to apply your thoughts? What about resistance as a stat though? Maybe resistance is your physical defense towards things. And on the other side of the coin we can do like spirit, your spiritual fortitude. And that determines the emotional defense. I'm also just going to take a page out of Fallout's book for a minute and put charisma on here. I think charisma works just because human beings need to talk to each other and speech is a buildable skill. If you want to go down the survival game route, maybe we can do some real liquid stats, like hunger and thirst for example. We can also make it to where these determine how high your max gauges get. By which I mean, the lower your hunger and or thirst is, the lower your max stamina, health, and mana might be. And of course, you need to adequately take care of yourself in those fields to get your stats back up. I could come up with 100 different other examples if I wanted to, but I do want to kind of keep this succinct. Really, in terms of just stats, you can be as complex or as simple as you want to. It helps that a single word vagueness going into every single stat means that it can encompass kind of a lot of things all at once. And obviously, all of these stats are supposed to do one thing in the grand scheme of things. They more or less dictate your responses to things happening in your daily life. And also, I'll just mention it for the sake of mentioning it, but if you didn't like any of the stats that I came up with, then some notable good examples that you can use at least as a base starting point would be games like Fallout and, of course, Dungeons & Dragons. I think both of those are perfectly adequate as they are. Might need to modify some things with both of those examples, but like I said, good starting point at the very least. Oh, and speaking of D&D, you can also consider proficiencies as their own status you pay attention to and build into. What immediately comes to mind is like trade skills, cooking or operating heavy machinery, or stuff like the programming graphic I used earlier. But what about things like status effects? Because those are technically stats too. How would we handle things like poison, temporary statuses and stuff? But maybe more importantly, what if we gamified like a person's traits? We could literally call it traits. This can be things like maybe, I don't know, a chronic illness, or maybe something like specific conditions. As a widely applicable example, let's consider somebody having ADHD. I think that definitely counts as a trait somebody would have, right? Okay, then how do we gamify ADHD? Well, like everything else, we can make it as complex as we want to. I don't personally have ADHD, but I know that a lot of people do, including people that I know. So as a baseline, what if we made it to where ADHD influences random bouts of proficiency bonuses towards something? There's no rhyme or reason to it. You just might excel at something, and one day you just don't, and then sometimes it comes back. It's the sort of thing that messes with people because of its unpredictability. And I know we're not exactly trying to talk about how it's an ongoing issue for people, but for the gamifying discussion, I think this does work as a good baseline. Something more applicable to me is that I'm actually a type 1 diabetic, so naturally that would influence pretty much everything that I do. And me having it for so long means that I can use it to sort of explain parts of my life, and it would have mechanics too, I think. On the one hand, I have a death timer that ticks every 4 hours, so, I have to eat and take insulin very regularly. But also because of me taking my medicine in the same places every time, the injections have caused scar tissue in specific parts of my body. So innately, I have a flat defense boost, I think. I can go on and on about, like, circulation problems and stuff like that, how that would influence temperature control, and my healing rate just in general. Like I said, it can get more complex. But this is starting to get rambly, so let's loop back around for a minute. I want to start talking about gameplay. How do we gamify a person's story? What kind of levels or quests or missions do you have? The things you do on a daily basis. So, gameplay. How can we expect our real-life video game to play like? Let's start off with the concept of combat. Because as it stands, I think that would be a pretty simple way to start. And without beating around the bush too much, I'm pretty sure most people don't face typical video game combat in their daily lives. At least I would hope not. And not in the typical sense either. Let's get this out of the way just real quick. We can use the mental argument again here, but I'm tired of saying that, so just to lay it out there. You could think of an individual problem in your life as a turn-based RPG battle almost. This is where your skills come into play, and those skills consume mana or stamina. Alternatively, each individual action you do could be something like a QuickTime event. Trying to get out of bed, for example, is a surprisingly hard QTE, as it turns out. What about like a person's day job, though? Would that be considered like a repeatable daily quest that you have to do? Maybe that's just a minigame in and of itself. I can't help but think about the Persona games whenever I talk about something sort of like this. Specifically, any point in those games where you're not running around the other world scenarios, you're not fighting shadows or whatever, just doing life stuff. And I mean, that could work because it's already video gamified. This point does get kind of weird because it's gonna seem like there's not really any combat in the real world that we can make into a video game mechanic. But for that I have two things. For one, no video game is perfect. So maybe we can excuse it in this way as just why would the real world video game be perfect if literally no other game is anyway. And I guess just as a funny alternative, maybe the real world is more analogous to Animal Crossing than anything else. Just, with more responsibilities you have to take care of and such. At all the same time though, I think it would be easy to justify your boss at your job telling you to do something and maybe framing that as a quest. A video game level would indicate traveling somewhere for me. And even if that traveling is a 10-minute car ride, why wouldn't that count as a level? It could be like level 1, your house, level 2, wherever you work. Level 3, I don't know, the grocery store. I think more so than any other subject we talked about so far, this is easily the one topic that's the most subjective. And as it stands, if you don't really agree with me on any of these points, well, that's up to you whether or not you want to. It's your life after all, so you make up the rules. Your life, your game, do your thing. We're getting about close to done here. But before we properly end, I have one more itty-bitty tiny segment that I do want to talk about. So keep everything that we talked about in the back of your mind, and let's wrap this thing up. My final question is the same question that I asked at the beginning of this video. What game do you see your life as? To me, this is the only question that has no definitive wrong answer. You could even say that you don't see your life as a video game, and actually that would be technically the most correct. And the subjectivity of this answer is precisely why I think it's super important and really interesting. And to this, I leave the question for y'all to answer. You can get a couple of obvious examples from this. Obviously, you're looking through your eyes, so it would make the most sense to say first person minus the shooter. And that's fair. And even though I did throw in an awful lot of RPG mechanics into this proverbial video game, that's because RPG is kind of a big deal to this discussion, I feel like. A role-playing game is to play a role in a video game. And if you're playing your role in the real world, then there should be numbers involved. There should be a role that you play. How you fit into the world and stuff like that. But arguably more important to me is not only that you consider your answer, and really feel how you feel about your answer, but also how you relate your life to the lives of other people around you. What are their games? What do they see their life as? Because you can weave it into a sort of pseudo-narrative for how the story of your game goes. If you imagine other people as playable characters, and they have games that play completely differently than yours, then it helps to set them apart, and again, I think for the sake of thinking about it, it's just a fun thought. The idea of camaraderie and a different person's perspective are always going to be super interesting to me. I genuinely think it's cool to be in somebody else's shoes. How do you see your life? How do they think they see yours? And with all of that being said, allow me to close out the video with this. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you want to think about video games but don't necessarily have the ability to play them right now, and you're among friends or you're just really bored and need something to occupy your time, then I think this is a fun way to go about it. It definitely leans into a daydreamy aspect, I feel like, but I don't know, sometimes you need that. And I mean, hey, if nothing else, I hope you just enjoyed the video. I know this is super different to anything else that I've probably ever made, but it was fun to talk about and fun to come up with answers and such for. And as always, if you like what I had to say today, then go ahead and like and subscribe. I upload every Friday, and we're getting really close to 500 subscribers on this YouTube channel. If you're maybe struggling for Christmas present ideas, I think this is a pretty cool one to have, personally. And I mean, hey, if nothing else, it's totally free, so I don't know, I think it's kinda cool. Does that count as begging? I feel like I'm begging. If you have your own things to say, then go ahead and leave it in the comments or bring it to the Discord. It's completely free to join. And it's also just a good place in general if you have some other ideas for video topics you want me to cover. And if you want some other ways to support me, then I have a Patreon where you can donate $1 a month to get your name read out loud at the end of these videos. And they'll give you exclusive access to a Discord channel in the Discord, where I publish stuff early, or you can just talk with other members or me in a more exclusive Discord channel. But if you don't end up doing literally any of that, then hey, don't feel bad or anything. Just watching to the end of this means a lot to me, so thank you for that. And once again, I hope you enjoyed, and have a good day, everybody. Cheese grater! And then I could do like a... Yeah! I could do